Coming out on Network Africa. Explosions and gunfire heard in Sudan's capital Khartoum as fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces enters its third day. Opponents from coalition in Senegal against Macky Sall of third term in office. And 55 migrants rescued from Côte d'Ivoire, Egypt, Eritrea, Nigeria, Palestine, Sudan, and Somalia. Hello and welcome to Network Africa on Channels Television. I'm Anne Mwawadu. Explosions and gunfire have been heard in Sudan's capital Khartoum as fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, enters its third day. According to the Sudanese Doctors Union, at least 100 civilians have been killed, but the true number is likely to be higher. Here's more on this report.
Plumes of smoke rose over the capital of Sudan, Khartoum, as it was bombarded for a third day in deadly fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. The deadly unrest erupted on Saturday in Sudan's capital and adjoining cities. The World Health Organization says that the ongoing fierce fighting has left at least 83 people dead and over 1,000 people wounded. Sudan's former Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok urged an immediate ceasefire and a return to dialogue between the country's army and the powerful Rapid Support Forces, RSF.
We demand an immediate ceasefire and to reach agreement that will lead to a permanent end to hostility. We need to at least reach a truce that will lead to establishing a humanitarian corridor that will allow civilians access to medicine, treatment, and food.
UN Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly called on both sides to return to talks.
There is a shared deep concern about the fighting, the violence that's going on in Sudan, the threat that poses to civilians, that it poses to the Sudanese nation, and potentially poses even to the region. Also, a strongly held view, again, across all of our partners on the need for an immediate ceasefire and a return to talks that were very promising in putting Sudan on the path to a full transition to civilian-led government.
But ultimately, the immediate future lies in the hands of the generals who are engaged in this fight, and we call upon them to put peace first, to bring an end to the fighting, to get back to negotiations.
The Arab League held an emergency meeting in Cairo where representatives of Arab states discussed the ongoing military conflict in Sudan. Similarly, the African Union's Peace and Security Council convened at the AU headquarters in Addis Ababa in an emergency session to discuss political and security developments in Sudan. The council said it strongly rejected any external interference that could complicate the situation. Meanwhile, the Pan-African Organization says the chairman of the African Union Commission, Musa Faki Mohammed, will travel immediately to Sudan to engage the parties towards a ceasefire. Egypt and South Sudan offered to stand as mediators amidst the ongoing rift. In a phone call between Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and South Sudan counterpart Salva Kiir, the two most influential direct neighbors to Sudan called on both sides in the power struggle to choose the voice of reason and peaceful dialogue. The international community has also expressed concern on social media over the escalating clashes. On Twitter, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister appealed for dialogue, restraint and wisdom. The UK embassy in Sudan encouraged British people in the country to stay home and heed travel advice, while the UN Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan denounced the fighting and demanded an immediate halt. Qatar and the United Arab Emirates have also called for an end to the violence, asking all sides to seek diplomatic solutions. The United Nations World Food Programme said it had temporarily halted all operations in Sudan after 3 of its employees were killed in the conflict. The incident has seriously impacted the organization's ability to move humanitarian workers and aid in Sudan.
Italian charity emergency vessel Life Support has rescued migrants from Côte d'Ivoire, Egypt, Eritrea, Nigeria, Palestine, Sudan and Somalia. Among the rescued are women, 3 children and 3 unaccompanied minors. Emmanuel Nanini, the head of the mission of Emergency Life Support, says that 55 people have been rescued from a rubber boat which was drifting away from the Libyan coast. According to the UN Migration Agency, the first 3 months of 2023 were the deadliest first quarter in 6 years for migrants crossing the central Mediterranean Sea in smugglers' boats, citing the nation's delays in initiating rescues as a contributing factor. The International Organization for Migration documented 441 migrant deaths along the dangerous sea routes between northern Africa and Europe's southern shores during January, February, and in March. But in 2017, 742 known deaths were documented in the same period, while 446 were recorded in the first 3 months of the year 2015. And more than 100 political and civil society groups in Senegal have formed a coalition to oppose the third term for President Macky Sall. 10 months ahead of the presidential elections, the coalition, in a declaration, called on Macky Sall to respect the constitution and refrain from running for an illegal and illegitimate third term. The president in power since 2012 has not clarified his intentions, but he rejects claims it will be unconstitutional for him to run again. The coordinator of the F-24 movement of vital forces, Mamadou Moudjou, plans to mobilize its members in the month of May. More than 120 parties signed the charter for the F-24 movement of vital forces. The tensions have been running high through the country for weeks now, with protests bringing the capital Dakar to a virtual standstill. The COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and of course conflict have all created significant food security challenges worldwide in the past years. But currently, millions of people around the world need urgent support in over 45 countries. And that's according to Rain Paulson, the director of Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations Office of Emergencies and Resilience. He adds that providing food aid is not enough to tackle the growing hunger crisis.
Probably one of the most visible changes, quite frankly, is the explosion, the mushrooming, the growth in the number of people in need of urgent assistance. The global humanitarian overview, that's a joint appeal coordinated by the United Nations together with partners. The Food and Agriculture Organization is part of it, launched at the end of last year an appeal to support some 230 million people. I mean, these numbers, quite frankly, are eye-watering, and it tells us that we need to do not just more, but we need to do it better. So you have a majority of the population relying on farming and a minority of the funding to support agricultural response activities. And this just simply doesn't make sense. We have year-on-year humanitarian responses. We also, as FAO, respond after what we call sudden onset events, after, for example, the tragedy that we've seen now of the earthquake in Turkey that's impacting both Turkey and Syria. This is also part of what we do, and it needs a time-sensitive response.
The General Assembly commemorated the International Day of Reflection and the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, with the UN Secretary General saying the world recognizes the journey of the Rwandan people towards healing, restoration, and reconciliation, but also remembers with shame the failure of the international community. Addressing member states, Antonio Guterres said they were together to mourn the more than 1 million children, women and men who perished in 100 days of horror 29 years ago. The overwhelming majority of the victims were Tutsi, but also Hutu and others who opposed the genocide.
We recognize the journey of the Rwandan people towards healing, restoration, and reconciliation. And we remember with shame the failure of the international community, the failure to listen and the failure to act. The killings did not start spontaneously. They were carefully planned long in advance and executed deliberately and systematically. It was premeditated murder in broad daylight. The hate and propaganda that paved the way to genocide in Rwanda was broadcast on TV, printed in newspapers, and blasted over radio. Today, the megaphones of hate are even bigger. Across the internet, incitement to violence, vicious lies and conspiracies, genocide denial and distortion, the demonization of the other proliferate with little to no checks. And that is why I have called for stronger guardrails, clear responsibilities, and greater transparency in the digital world.
Let us remain committed to upholding the rights of every individual and addressing the drivers of hate speech, online and offline. Let us stand firmly against any form of discrimination. And let us keep our focus on education. Given all that we see around us in 2023, this is our duty. And let us be sincere. This is our only chance.
We told you earlier about explosions and gunfire being heard in Sudan's capital, Khartoum. Now we have Mariama Diallo, VOA's Africa regional correspondent from Nairobi, Kenya, to give us an update on this. Hello, Mariam. Thank you for joining us on Network Africa.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
Let's begin with an update of the situation in the Sudanese capital as we speak.
Well, so far, what we know is that there are reports of about 100 people killed and over 600 injured, according to the International Rescue Committee, which actually announced today that it was ceasing operations in most part of the country. Sudan's Army Chief Al-Burhan called the RSF group, the Rapid Support Forces, a rebellious group that needs to be dissolved. And in return, the RSF leader, Dagalo, also known as Hemeti, called on the international community to intervene against what he's calling it's like alleged crimes committed by Al-Burhan, whom he accuses at the moment of bombing civilians.
Mariama, we know that this is the third day of fierce fighting between the two top military men in the country. How did this even escalate in the first place?
Well, I think it's good to kind of remind people that these two generals were actually friends. They banded together to topple al-Bashir back in 2019. So I think this came a little bit as a surprise because negotiations have been going well in the past 4 months. So I don't think many saw it coming. There are reports that because there was talk of integration of the Gallo's forces into the Sudanese army, maybe that could have been part of what started it. But I guess we'll have to get more info as things calm down, hopefully at some point soon.
We know despite international community's call for a ceasefire, it appears that both parties are not even willing to come together. They're not willing to negotiate on this. Do you see the conflict lasting for more days?
Well, at this point, it's hard to tell. Things have escalated very quickly, as we saw just from Saturday, and has been going strong 3 days later. IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in Eastern Africa, actually convened an emergency virtual meeting on Sunday and had decided to send 3 presidents, South Sudan's Salva Kiir, Kenya's William Ruto, and Djibouti's Ismail Omar Guelleh to Khartoum to try to broker a ceasefire. I asked actually the spokesperson today, whom I interviewed, how quickly can we expect them there in person? And he was saying any day now, although I wonder because of the issues of the two parties claiming different parts, different establishments, including the airport. And there were also reports that flights were being suspended. So I wonder how fast they will be able to have access and get into Khartoum.
Mariama, we know that during conflicts like this, aid, humanitarian, and even medical workers will be feeling the heat. They will be greatly affected. Hospitals in the capital are struggling to treat the injured. But how are they coping with all of this?
I think it's hard to tell, and I'm sure the local hospitals are doing their best, but it's hard to assess with everything that's going on. Their work is probably harder now when you have international organizations such as the International Rescue Committee, what I talked about just earlier, saying that they are ceasing operations in most places. And IRC is saying that the conflict has actually disrupted humanitarian actions where over a third of the population, an estimated 15 million people, including refugees, are experiencing acute food insecurity. So think about that was the problem before. And now with everything compounded in the last 3 days, I can only imagine what the situation is like and how chaotic and how hard it must be.
All right. Thank you very much, Mariama Diallo, VOA's Africa regional correspondent from Nairobi. Thanks a lot for your contribution on Network Africa.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, despite all odds, Kenya finally launches its first operational satellite into space. We'll bring you the details in just a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. United Nations agency says a dire lack of humanitarian funding has left hundreds of thousands of refugees and internally displaced people in Chad facing hunger in the coming months. Pierre Honorat, director of UN World Food Programme, WFP, in Chad, says that as the country moves into the lean season in between harvests, food assistance could grind to a complete halt, adding that an additional 300,000 people in need of aid are internally displaced Chadians. The WFP says that after fleeing conflict and violence, refugees, internally displaced people and their host communities are facing growing food insecurity and malnutrition, high food prices, and the destructive effects of climate change.
It's surrounded by countries with crises and hosting some 600,000 refugees from Sudan, Niger, Cameroon, and Centrafrique. It's one of the biggest caseloads in Africa, and the number keeps rising with the recent conflict in the communities in Sudan. 2023 is another very difficult year, whereby we have absolutely no funding from May onwards for the refugees and the displaced people. Today, an appeal to help the government of Chad to support them in their effort to host so many refugees with so many crises at the same time in current context. And again, I was mentioning the upcoming very difficult lean season that we are looking at, and the urgent need for WFP for the next 6 months of $140 million.
The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has announced that growth in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to slow to 3.6% this year, as a big funding squeeze tied to the drying up and aid of access to private finance hits the region. According to the IMF, if no measure is taken, this shortage of funding may force countries to reduce fiscal resources for critical development like health, education, infrastructure, holding the region back from developing its true potential. Sub-Saharan African countries lagged significantly in revenue collections, with a media tax ratio of only 13% of GDP in the year 2022, and that's when you compare it to 18% in other emerging economies and developing countries and 27% in advanced economies.
I wish I was bearing better news, but unfortunately we're expecting growth to decelerate from 3.9% to 3.6% in 2023. And this, to a large extent, reflects the big funding squeeze that countries are facing at the moment. So there are a number of reforms that need to be pursued. I think first and foremost, of course, is policies to strengthen the resilience of economies. So in many countries, for example, there's a big challenge on mobilizing more domestic revenues. That needs to be addressed wherever that's the main challenge. Second, I think it's also important to consider policies to insulate domestic economies from external environment. So allowing exchange rates to adjust, interest rates to be recalibrated to reflect better, to reduce inflation, are all going to be very important part of the policy response to this adverse external environment. We are engaging like never before with the region. Of course, over the last couple of years, we've provided considerable financing to the tune of around $60 billion to support the region weather the very difficult economic environment it was facing. And we continue to try and provide as much financing as possible to support countries in the coming months. As important, however, of course, are policies and reforms that need to be pursued by countries, and we are deeply engaged with working with countries to navigate and to put in place the right types of policies in each individual country.
United Nations spokesman Stefan Dujarric says that there had been a horrendous distortion of comments by the Deputy Secretary General referring to Kenya. The spokesman said the comments by Amina Mohammed have been taken out of context. It's coming as the leaked documents reported that Amina Mohammed told the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in February that Kenyan President William Ruto was ruthless and that she doesn't trust him. However, Kenya's UN Ambassador Martin Kimani said that he had spoken to Mr. Guterres and Amina Mohammed to seek clarity on the import of their concerning reported sentiments.
I think, especially for the Deputy Secretary General, who has been throughout her career, a strong, unimpeachable champion of Africa's leadership in the world. It's just what she said it's completely distorted. It gives a wrong image, and I think and just to focus on what was attributed to her, I think it's also important to note that she'll be going to she'll be going later this month to Nairobi on a trip that in fact had been pre-scheduled. She looks forward to seeing President Ruto as well as the UN leadership. And it needs to be said yet again to underscore the fact that for us, Kenya has, through the decades, and continues to be a trusted partner and very generous host to UN institutions.
And finally on the program, the first operational Kenyan satellite has successfully been put into orbit by a rocket of the company SpaceX, which took off from California in the United States. The launch, initially scheduled for Monday evening in the United States, had been postponed several times last week due to bad weather conditions. The satellite, developed by 9 Kenyan engineers, will collect agricultural and environmental data, including on floods, drought, and wildfires that authorities plan to use for disaster management and to combat food security. According to Space in Africa, as of 2022, more than 50 African satellites have been sent into space. Egypt was the first country on the continent to send a satellite into space in 1998, while Kenya had sent its first nano-satellite into space in 2018.
We have the challenges that have been brought about by climate change, which the satellite, by virtue of being able to capture images, we can be able to see contributing factors. For example, deforestation. We can monitor forest changes. We can monitor urbanization changes.
And that's Network Africa for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anne Mwawadu.